The first topic I want to cover in this course is building controlled components. And I think the best way to cover this topic is to do a little bit of refactoring in this user preferences form component that I have here. So you can see what we've got here is a pretty basic form. It's got an input for your email address, a toggle to say whether or not you want to receive marketing emails, and then a button to go ahead and submit this form. Now, we're not actually submitting the form when you actually click that button, but you can see that we do have a little bit of console log action going on here where we're submitting some preferences. There's the email, there's the newsletter flag. So if I set this to be something like adam@example.com and go ahead and try to update settings again, you can see all this data is bound properly and this stuff's getting sent through. If I turn off the toggle and try to update the settings, we'll now receive newsletter as false. So the piece of this component that I want to look at is this little toggle control here. So this is actually a completely custom toggle that behaves just like a checkbox, and it's built with just like a span over here and some classes and some bindings and stuff. Now it'd be really nice to be able to reuse this toggle in different places of our application because there's a little bit of complexity in making it work. But right now, the way things are built, this toggle is kind of baked into this component. You can see we're manually binding the ARIA checked attributes to whether or not the received newsletter data property is true or false. And we also have a click handler that toggles the newsletter, and all that does is just reverse this value from true to false or from false to true. And then when someone presses the space bar while it's focused, we also do the same thing, toggling the newsletter. So why don't we go ahead and try to extract this toggle out into its own component and then use that component in this form. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file in the components directory for this project. I'm going to call it toggle input. It's a best practice in Vue to name your components with multi-word names to avoid any collisions with upcoming HTML elements that might be introduced in the future. So we'll call this toggle input.view. We'll scaffold out a little Vue template here. And I'll close the sidebar so we have a little bit more space to work. So I'm going to head back over to the user settings form, and let's start by just copying the actual template here. So we'll copy this whole span and everything that comes with it, and we'll just kind of paste it in here. So we're going to have to go ahead and bring over some data and methods and stuff too, right, to make sure this actually works. So why don't we go ahead and add a data property here called value that's going to keep track of whether or not toggle is on or off. So we'll default it to false here. And instead of checking receive newsletter to determine if we should have this checked or not, let's go ahead and check value. Because again, we're trying to make this generic and not specifically tied to this newsletter form. Similarly, let's go ahead and add a method called toggle instead of toggle newsletter that inverts this value from false to true or the reverse depending on what the current value is. So we'll go ahead and change these references up here from toggle newsletter to just toggle. And now if we head back to our user settings form, we can try pulling in this component. So let's pull in the toggle input here. We'll just kind of put that in place and make sure that down here we go ahead and import the toggle input from our components directory so that we actually have access to it. Now if we head down into the component itself, we can add this components property, and that's where we can specify any components that we want to be able to use inside of this component. So you can see over here in the browser, we had some errors while we were working on this, but we kind of worked through those as we went, but we do have two toggles in place now. So let's go ahead and delete the toggle that we had kind of implemented by hand here. And now if we go and sort of clear out these errors and give ourselves some room, let's try and play around with it a little bit. It looks like we can still click it and toggle it on and off, which is kind of nice. But if we head into the console and go ahead and try and submit this form, you can see, okay, receive newsletter is false. That's what we would expect. But if I change this to on and submit it again, well, receive newsletter is still false. So we haven't done anything to bind the state of this toggle to our receive newsletter state that we have in the parent component, which is the state that we want to submit when we submit the form. So how can we actually get this working? Well, I think the best way to understand how you build components like this toggle component is to take a look at how working with regular form inputs works in Vue. So if we head up to the top here, you can see we have this input field with a v-model on it where we're binding the value of this email field to our email data down here, right? So if we go ahead and close the console here, you can see that when we sort of monitor this data, it's updating reactively as we type. And if we make changes to Vue state directly, maybe to john@example.com, or when I commit this, you can see it updated to John up here in the DOM as well. So it sounds like what we want to be able to do with our toggle is sort of implement v-model, right? We want to be able to have this toggle state reflect the state in the parent component. So how does v-model really work under the hood? How can we go about re-implementing that on our own component? Well, it turns out v-model under the hood is actually pretty simple conceptually, at least. All v-model really is a shortcut for two different bindings on the input. So it's a shortcut for a value prop. So if we replace v-model with just value equals email, you can see that the DOM state here is still going to reflect the state in the component. So if I update this to be jnetexample.com, well, the component updated here as well. And this is what we mean when we talk about controlled components. The value or the state of this input is controlled by the parent. But the problem that we have here is if we make changes directly in the DOM, well, now these changes are not being reflected in the actual data property in our Vue component. So the way to get this working is to listen for input events on the input field and update the Vue component state to match whatever the user typed. To do that, all we have to do is add @input on the input element itself. And then when this event comes in, we want to say that our email property should be equal to event.target.value. So the event target is going to be the input itself, and the value is going to be whatever value is in there after the user is done typing. And now you can see that if we make changes to the DOM, those are reflected in Vue state down here. And if we make changes in Vue state and commit them, that these changes are actually updated in the DOM as well. So this is a fundamental idea of component communication in Vue. You pass props into a component, and when the component wants to tell you about things that have happened, it fires an event back, and the parent can make decisions about what to do with the information in that event. A good way to understand that is to realize that here in this input event handler, we're not actually forced to store the exact event target value as the email. We can manipulate it or store something different if we wanted to. For example, say we wanted to force all email addresses to be uppercase. Here I could say to uppercase on the value that was coming in, and you can see that as I type, everything I type is being converted to uppercase instantly. And whenever this email property changes, which is what's happening when we assign it to this new value, Vue is re-rendering that component with the new state. So the state that the input shows is always the state that Vue holds in its component state. This data here is the real source of truth, and this is what's used anytime Vue needs to re-render this element. So using this new knowledge of how v-model really works under the hood, we can implement this same sort of pattern on our toggle input to turn it into a controlled component. So let's get rid of this to uppercase thing here and just go ahead and add a value prop to the input. So we'll pass in a value instead of having it hold its own state. So we'll pass in that receive newsletter data property that we have here. Now let's head over to the toggle input, and instead of storing value in state, let's accept it as a prop. So we can get rid of our data entirely here. And now if we head over to the DOM, you'll actually see that this toggle is going to reflect the state of receive newsletter. So if I toggle this on, well, the checkbox turns on. If I toggle it off, the checkbox turns off. However, if I go ahead and click it, you'll see that we get an error in the console. And the error is that we're not allowed to mutate props directly. You have to think about props as immutable values. Instead, what we want to do, like we demonstrated with the input control up here, is we want to emit an event telling the parent that the user has tried to change the value of this toggle so the parent can update its state to match the user's intent. So instead of just changing value to equal not this value here, why don't we emit an input event using the same name that we used on the actual text input, and we'll just pass through the new value that we want the parent to update the toggle to be. So in this case, it's going to be the same thing that we had before, just the opposite of whatever value is currently. So if value is true, when the user clicks it, we want to emit that the new value should be false. Now, if we head back over to the user settings form, we can go ahead and listen for that event by saying @input and then writing whatever logic we want to happen whenever this event is fired. So it's going to be a little different than it was in the text input case because we don't actually have an event target in this case. With custom events, you just receive whatever the payload was that was sent with the event. So we can capture that using an arrow function. So we can get the new value, and then all we have to do is say that receive newsletter should now be equal to the new value. Why don't we go ahead and split this up onto multiple lines so it's a little bit easier to see in this split view layout here. So I'll pull this down so we can kind of see what's going on. Okay, so we've got a value prop where we're passing in the value of receive newsletter. And then whenever an input event happens, we want to receive that new value and update receive newsletter to match that new value. So if we head back over to Vue here and watch our state, if we've done this correctly, we should be able to toggle this and see the value updating in DevTools. And if we go ahead and check this, we should see it update in DevTools as well as in the DOM. Now, the nice thing about what we've done here is that because we've used sort of the traditional names for the prop as well as the event, Vue will actually let us replace all of this code with a v-model binding directly on our custom component. So we can say v-model equals receive newsletter, delete this stuff, and now with any luck, this should behave the same way. So if we head over to user settings form, we can see, yep, the state is still updating. And if we update the stuff here, it's still updating as well. So now in this parent component, we can actually get rid of this toggle newsletter method because we're not using that at all. And if we head back over to the console and kind of clear out these old errors here, you can see that when we submit the form, we have jnetexample.com receive newsletter false. Turn this on and submit the form, receive newsletter is true. So now we have this new toggle input component that you can just throw v-model on anytime you need to use it, and it's totally portable and you can just reuse it in different parts of your application anytime you need this sort of toggle control, and you don't have to sort of re-implement any of the complexity of it anytime you want to use it. You can use it basically exactly like a regular checkbox or radio button or input or select. It kind of just behaves exactly like a native form element now, which is really cool. So that's sort of the fundamentals around how you build a controlled component in Vue, a component that doesn't actually have any of its own state and instead is controlled by state in the parent and communicates with that parent by firing events anytime the user has tried to change the value of the component.